Just to clarify, this is not a story from Let's Read himself. This story was submitted by a subscriber who created their own YouTube channel. I started narrating stories on YouTube because after sending every story I wrote to all the big names and a few lesser-known names, I got no response. No thanks for sending, no your story sucks, nothing. Now I won't mention who they are, but most of you should know who I'm talking about. Although one big name did read a short story of mine, which I'm very thankful for, and it wasn't my best. And this went on for a while. After months of frustration, I finally realized that it wasn't going to happen, so I decided to narrate my own stories, create a YouTube channel, pick a name, and then post them myself. How hard could it be? And so I did. My stories were good, at least I thought so. And to my surprise, a few people actually liked them, and after a while, asked if I would narrate their stories. Wow, really? Okay, I thought. They would send them to me via email, which I gave them, and I would narrate their stories. And that started the ball rolling. I was talking to a coworker one day about narrating stories for fun, and they suggested that I check out an app called Reddit and search short scary stories and no sleep. They said they posted a few stories on there and thought that it would be perfect for me, so I did. I created an account and started my search, and there I found all kinds of amazing stories. I contacted some authors through comments and personal messages, asking permission to read their stories. Most were cool with it, and although I did get a few rejections, I just kept on asking. And always ask permission, by the way. Things were going great. I was narrating amazing stories, and people were liking them, and I even earned enough karma on Reddit to start my own community. I decided to use it for people to send stories to, and people actually did. All the while, I still searched other communities for stories to read. That was until I found that story. I should have known by their username that it wasn't a good idea. I'm not going to mention the name of it because it still sends chills up my spine just thinking about it, and I'm shaking as I write this, believe it or not. It was around 1 a.m. Insomnia set in, and I was sitting at my dining room table searching Reddit. When I found that story, it blew me away. It had it all: drama, suspense, emotion, everything. And I contacted the author through personal messaging asking permission, except for some reason I signed in using my real name, not my stage name. Big mistake. I realized what I did, but it was too late. I had already sent it. Anyway, mere seconds went by and I actually received a reply. "Yes, I've been waiting for this," they said. Thinking they'd been waiting for someone to read one of their stories, just like I was, I replied, "Thank you," and planned to go on with my night. Until I received my own personal message from the author. "Hi, my name's Susan. Want to talk?" I figured, what the hell? I'm not doing anything else. What could it hurt? So I sent back, "Sure." After about a 30-minute conversation, I found out that 1, the author was female, 2, we both like Stephen King, 3, we both like horror movies, and 4, we both lived in the United States, only a few states away from each other. I started getting tired, and I let her know, and we ended the conversation, both saying goodnight. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I got a message from her saying, "I'm glad to have someone like you to talk to. I missed that." I shrugged it off and went to sleep. A couple of days went by, and I came home from work and found a note on my door. It said, "Hi. Sorry I missed you. Love, Susan." What? Love? I only talked to her for like half an hour. How'd she get my address? What did I just get myself into? I took the note off the door and quickly went inside, locking the door and calling the police. I told them the story, and they said that there was nothing they could do until an actual crime was committed. Wow, very reassuring. I hung up from them and tried to do my normal routine. Make coffee, get changed, drink coffee, and so on and so forth. I couldn't get that note out of my head. The doorbell rang. I froze and slowly walked to the window to see who it was. It was a woman. She was about 5.5 feet tall, tattered, dirty clothes, long, stringy brown hair. It looked like she hadn't bathed in a month. And I immediately knew it was Susan. I had to end this quick, right now, before it turned ugly, and ugly it turned. I opened the door and said, "Look, Susan, I don't know what you think's going on, but I just wanted to read your story. That's it. I'm sorry if you thought there was something more, but there's not. Just go home." I shut the door and walked back into the house. She screamed like a wild woman. She started pounding on the door, screaming, "I love you! I love you!" I immediately ran to the phone to call 911. A rock or brick or something came crashing through the front window. I turned and saw that crazy woman climbing into my house, screaming, "Read my story! Read my story!" The shards of glass from the broken window cutting her as she climbed in, blood on the window and the floor. The dispatcher said, "911, what's your emergency?" And I barely had time to say anything before she charged, slamming into me, knocking me over the desk and falling to the floor herself. She was kicking and screaming like a lunatic. I got up, phone still in hand, and smashed it hard against her temple as she was getting up. See, I don't hit women, but this woman deserved it. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head and the screaming stopped and she fell to the floor unconscious. I heard sirens outside. I guess the 911 operator heard it all. The cops came, took my statement, and they made me stay outside while the paramedics tended to Susan, if that even was her real name. The cops put her in cuffs and the paramedics took her to the ambulance. On her way out, she looked at me, laughing, and they put her inside and left. The cops finished up and did the same. I was left with a messed up door, a broken window, blood all over the place, a broken desk, and a broken phone. All over one story. And I was done. I moved out that night. I left all my stuff behind. I slept in my car till payday, then rented a room off a coworker. And I never narrated another story again. So, if any of my subscribers are reading this and wondered whatever happened to me, now you know. This is why I stopped narrating stories on YouTube.
This happened to me over 30 years ago, but I remember the feeling of fear as if it were yesterday. I was in college, a female, taking a course on outdoor survival. The course ended with a 3-day, 3-night wilderness solo. We were allowed to take a backpack, empty canteen, sleeping bag, knife, 6 matches, a rope, a plastic sheet, a change of clothes, extra socks, tablets, small cooking pot and spoon, and that's about it. We were not allowed to bring food or water since part of our training was identifying edibles and finding a water source. Once I was dropped off, I had to hike to find a spot to set up to camp. First, I had to place a flag on a tree near my drop-off point so that I could be located 3 days later for pickup. I was loving life. It was just me and nature. I had zero fear, even as nightfall began. I enjoyed the sounds of the woods all around me and didn't mind not having a tent. I built a small fire and had a great feeling of peace. I slept well that night, but woke up thirsty. My search for a water source began. Happily, I found a muddy stream. I let the water settle in my pot, placed the tablets in the water, and boiled it for good measure. Yuck. Not a great taste, but at least I was hydrated. All went well, and I had a great time until my last day. It was early afternoon on the last day and time to break camp. I cleaned up my camp area and hiked out to my drop-off spot. As I sat leaning up against a tree, I heard the sound of a vehicle off in the distance. I figured it had to be my pickup. As I waited, a vehicle that I'd never seen before pulled up into the dirt path in front of me. Immediately, I realized that I did not know the man who was driving. He gave me this really odd look. My gut told me that he was bad news. He asked what I was doing there, and if I was alone. I said that my friends were behind me breaking camp. He gave me this knowing look, got back in his vehicle, and rode off. I was completely terrified. I knew I had to hide, and fast. I ran into the woods and hid. As I ran, I heard that same car come back. I stayed as quiet as I could and remained hidden. I heard him get out of the car. I could hear him calling to me, walking through the brush looking for me. I was so afraid. Eventually, he gave up. I heard the car door slam and the engine start and the car pull away. Going back to my drop-off point was now not an option, so I began hiking through the woods, hoping I would find base camp. After walking for what felt like hours, I found a forest ranger. I told him who I was and what happened to me. He told me that I'd done the right thing since a young woman had been raped the night before, and the police and Forest Service had been searching the area for this man. Happily, he drove me to the base camp, where I learned that another girl in my class had had a creepy encounter with the man the night before. She had scared him away by blowing a brass whistle until help arrived. If there's anything to learn from this, it's always to trust your gut. And I never camped alone again.
I grew up in the Chicago suburb of Skokie, which is about 10 to 11 miles north of downtown Chicago. I had a pretty regular, uneventful childhood. Almost everything before the age of 11 is a blur of just happy memories. I wasn't bullied in school. I never broke any bones falling off my bike. I was just kind of ignorant, a happy-go-lucky preteen boy with not so much as a care in the world. That all changed one Saturday after a visit to my grandma Pearl's house. I remember I was almost at the end of 5th grade, and we went to my grandma's house one Saturday for dinner. I loved my grandma Pearl, but my God, were her trips to her place boring for me. My mom and dad forbade me from ever bringing along my Game Boy as they thought that it would be rude, but then they also didn't seem to notice when I inevitably wandered off to try and keep myself entertained. Normally, I'd just wander off, explore her house, and wait until dinner was ready, but on this particular Saturday, I was feeling hungry. I went and asked Grandma how much longer dinner would be and felt my heart sink when I heard her say, "Not for at least another hour, sweetie." I walked into the kitchen, out of sight from my parents and Grandma, and then peered into the little oven window to see what we were having. I think it was some type of brisket or some other kind of roast. I just remember seeing it sizzling away and wanting to speed up the process. So, dumb 11-year-old me decides to crank up the heat. I wasn't so dumb that I cranked up the dial and then walked away. I stayed put in the kitchen, keeping an eye on the meat as it got browner and browner. Eventually, I started to smell a slight burning, but it still smelled okay, and the meat hadn't gotten black or anything, so I just went back to what I was doing, then figured I'd just check back in a few minutes. I don't know if something occupied my attention a little too long or if the temperature of the meat was suddenly such that it burst into flames. But the next thing I remember, I could see black smoke coming out of the oven, so I panicked. I ran into the living room, told my grandma that something was burning, so she got up and followed me into the kitchen. I ran up to the oven, pointed at the black smoke, and watched my grandma's expression suddenly and drastically change. I knew I was going to be in trouble if they found out that I ruined dinner, but the way my grandma started acting really scared me. I'd never seen her look so, I don't know, not mad, but horrified. And because I don't know what she was feeling, I assumed the worst and thought that my sweet old grandma was about to explode on me. Only she didn't, and I can barely even describe the feelings of fear and confusion I felt when she suddenly laid down on the kitchen floor and curled up into a ball. I remember how her eyes were wide, staring off at nothing as she sort of whispered something that I couldn't hear. There were only a few moments of that confusion before my parents appeared in the kitchen, my dad stepping over my grandma to deal with the burnt meat situation, while my mom kneeled next to Grandma asking, Mom, are you okay?" I had no idea what was happening. I just knew that I'd somehow caused it all by burning dinner, and I felt god-awful about it. Dad drove me back home. He was irate with me, but I was pretty angry at myself, too. All I wanted was to eat dinner a little easier, and now I'd be lucky if I got a PB&J after being banished to my room for giving my grandma a heart attack. That's honestly what I thought it was at first. And even when my dad said it wasn't a heart attack, I still had this terrible feeling that something equally awful had happened, something that was all my fault. My dad stayed home after I went up to my room and lay under my covers just crying, while my mom stayed with my grandma to make sure that she was okay. She returned home later that night, by which point it was way past my bedtime, but even so, they wake me up, sit on my bed, and have a little talk with me. I won't tell you everything they said to me, or this would take hours to write up, but the long and short of it was, my grandma had lived through World War II. My parents gave me a full history lesson right there in bed and explained why the smell of burning meat had upset my grandma so much. I remember being absolutely gripped with horror the entire way through. I couldn't believe that people could be so evil to each other over something so small and arbitrary. And it killed me to think that my own selfishness had brought back such horrific memories from my grandma, who had escaped a place called Sobibor in the 1940s. She moved to America when the war was over, met my grandpa, and the rest is history. I guess my mom and dad thought the best thing to do was to just be honest with me, having probably realized that my fear of the unknown would hurt worse than the dark truth. I suppose in hindsight it was the best thing to do, but it still messed with my head so bad that I barely slept a wink that night. I called my grandma the next day to apologize for scaring her, and told her that my parents had explained all that she'd been through. She obviously didn't want me to know, and I guess my mom and dad were complicit in shielding me from that ugly truth. I suppose it's like a lot of things with kids. You want to keep them as innocent as possible until absolutely necessary, then just hope they're equipped to deal with it. Truth be told, I didn't even know I was Jewish, or at least had Jewish ancestry. My mom didn't practice her religion, and her parents didn't mind if she married someone who didn't either. It wasn't like she was ashamed of her heritage or anything, she just learned that a lot of Jewish holidays brought back awful memories for my grandma, so our place became a kind of safe space for her. I'm not a religious person myself, none of that really interests me, but just like my mom, I still have a reverence for those that came before, or as my grandma called them, the survivors. This was in the mid-2000s when I was in about 2nd or 3rd grade. I lived in the rural Midwest and went to a decent-sized elementary school. For a few weeks, a friend of mine I chatted with often was absent from school. I was confused and curious as to why he hadn't been attending school for so many days. And soon I found out from the other kids in the school that he was taking time to rest and recover after a very traumatic experience in his family. I'm not going to reveal names as, for one, I don't remember the boy's name, and I don't want to reveal any personal info about those names that I do remember. And for the sake of easier reading, I'll call the boy who was absent Mike. The standard chats and occasional gossip I'd shared with friends on the playground and in the cafeteria took a very dark turn once word got out of why Mike was absent. You see, one day, a friend of mine, we'll call him Chad, told us that Mike's mother was murdered. Hearing later from some of the school employees, my own parents, I found out that this horrific act was carried out by the boyfriend of Mike's sister. The killer had snuck into the bedroom of his girlfriend's mother. He then either stabbed her to death or slit her throat in her sleep. I don't remember the exact details. I was only around 9 or 10 years old, so hearing this was especially shocking. Having something like that happen so close to me, even more so. I'm not quite sure how reliable this is, but according to Chad, the mother didn't want her daughter's relationship to get intimate until she and her boyfriend were married. She also didn't want them to get married until they had been together for a few years and she had gotten to know the guy well enough to know that he would treat her daughter well. The sister's boyfriend was furious at this and believed that the best way to get what he wants would be to eliminate what he saw as a roadblock. I was disgusted and disturbed at such a selfish, pathetic, and creepy move. This so-called man murdered an innocent woman just because he wanted to get intimate with her daughter and was delusional enough to believe that she would go along with him after he carried out the gruesome act. I remember one day on the way back home from school, my mom pointed out that the funeral procession was happening around the neighborhood we lived in. It honestly surprised me that it was that close to where we live. I remember seeing Mike in his black suit and tie with a very somber and serious look on his face. At school, I remember him being a pretty easygoing, cheerful guy who enjoyed cracking jokes with me. Seeing him like this hurt, and I can only imagine how this terror had affected him. Horror like this seems like it would stay with you, but honestly, I only just remember it, and there's still so many details that I don't quite recall. I don't even remember if Mike ever came back to school for the rest of the semester or not. If he did, I have no idea what I would have even said to him. What the hell do you even say to someone who had just had their life so cruelly changed at a young age? What do you say to someone whose mother was just taken from them by some heartless monster? Something about my memory of this being hazy unnerves me, and I wonder if being hit with this cold reality at such a young age influenced my often cynical outlook of the world. I hope Mike and his family are doing well, because no one deserves to have to go through that.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.